I'm a sysadmin by background, so I worked at Penn State where I did Red Hat administration, and then just kind of used Puppet there to kind of scale out how many Red Hat servers we had. We were migrating from AIX and Solaris, those services, onto Red Hat. Needed Puppet to do that as quickly as we needed to, and sort of fell in love with Puppet. Ended up puppetizing all of my day job, and so I got shoved off to other things that didn't involve Puppet, and kind of started to get sad, and decided to join Puppet Labs and be a professional services engineer, traveling around the world, spreading the love of Puppet, helping people get started with it. But I got tired of the travel, so I moved yet again to be in product for the Puppet Forge, and love it, here to stay. So I want to get a sense for who I'm talking with here. How many of you are using Puppet today? By show of hands. Okay. How many of you were using Puppet a year or more ago? Okay. So I'm judging from those answers that a lot of you have been using Puppet really brand new in this last year. That's awesome. So amongst that, let's go with Puppet versions. How many of you have been using the Puppet 3 series or higher? So Puppet 3, Puppet 3.1, Puppet 3.2. Okay, great. And so what about Puppet 2.7 or, well, let's just say Puppet 2.7, because I'm always curious about that. Less than 2.7, put your hands up. Okay, feel free to talk to me later. You shouldn't be on 2.7 anymore, Adam. Feel free to talk to me later if you're still using 2.6. I'd like to know what's holding you back and how we can help you move on. And then, of course, we have Puppet Enterprise, which I'll talk to you about in a few minutes. How many of you are using Puppet Enterprise? Thank you. And just for a sense of who's traveled from where, how many of you are not from the Bay and came from somewhere else today? Awesome, a couple of you. Well, thank you for joining us, everybody else from the Bay. I was asking someone who lives in the Bay earlier what his commute time was. How many of you had to commute more than 30 minutes to get here? That's so sad. I'm sorry for that. Thank you for enduring the pain of commutes to get here. It was on a bicycle, so that counts. So my commute in Portland is on a bike, and so that takes me about 20 minutes, and I find that to be, it's enjoyable. It's a nice bike ride. I get to bike along the river. But I keep saying to myself, how can I get this down by 5 minutes, down by 5 minutes? I hate commuting. It blows my mind to be here and commuting that long. So we're here because we live in interesting times. We're, all related to systems administration in some way, whether you're on the development side or on the administration side and the management side. We're all here because we're trying to solve problems with technology. And today we're being asked to do much more than we ever were before. We're doing more servers to launch more services that are more critical than ever because they're being used by more people than ever before. How many of you still have maintenance windows where, like on a weekend, you take the service down and it's okay to be down for 12 hours and then you come back on the weekend? A couple years ago, that might have been the whole room. So back at Penn State, I was kind of right at the edge of that shift. At Penn State, we had very deliberate maintenance windows for a lot of the, well, let me back up. I was responsible for a lot of the core academic services. So I managed our file services when we had multiple endpoints for that. We had Samba, we had NFS, we had AFP. And we had some core LDAP and Kerberos infrastructure, critical services for the entire university. Some of those were on a much higher SLA. But some of those, we still had this accepted, well, we'll turn on this maintenance window. Maybe it'll be in the summer when there are less students, but it'll be on a weekend, and we can just turn the service off for 12 hours, and we have the whole weekend in case something goes wrong. That was okay, but as I can tell from the rest of the room here, that's not the norm anymore. People expect these services to be up any time of the day, whether you have some kind of consumer-oriented thing like a banking site, whether you're facing internal staff that might be working on the weekend. It doesn't matter. Everybody expects these services to be up and reliable at all times. And I sort of had this shift at Penn State where and the expectation is being driven by people's expectations of technology. For the Samba file service that I was used to, we had to get that service to be more compatible with Windows clients and Mac clients. We had to make it more performant, and we had to make it more accessible because the students coming in were starting to use services like Dropbox or Box or Windows file sharing. I think it was SkyDrive at the time. And they use those services because they're always up, they're easy to use, they're accessible to all their clients. But at our academic environment, that didn't work. We had these university-wide file sharing services because the faculty wants to share things with their students. They expect the students to share with the faculty. We want all those files controlled. We want them all on premise. We don't want them shared out all over the world. Sometimes there's compliance issues that we have to take into account. And so it wasn't acceptable to have these students using Dropbox or whatever else. But that meant that as an IT organization, we had to do better. We had to do it faster, and we had to do it much better. So in our maintenance windows, we would say, well, summertime is when we start to develop and roll out new services. We'd have a weekend to do the maintenance window. That's not acceptable anymore. 9 months is too long. 3 months is too long. And the old practices to kind of keep up with these things are no longer necessary. You can't just hire more sysadmins to scale out to the number of servers. When we did Solaris and AIX at Penn State, we had, I think, one person for, I think, a dozen servers or something like that. And they would just hire on whenever they needed to deploy a new service. They knew as part of the cost of that service, they were going to hire a new admin, they're going to bring them on, and they would be responsible for that service or a portion of it. That just can't scale anymore. When you need more services, more servers to run those services, more to do it more reliably, you can't hire that many admins. You're asking more of your admins. You don't want to cut them off. You want to make sure that they have the tools they need. And the old constraints that used to hold us back are gone as well. You don't need those admins racking servers and kind of bootstrapping them and then running their scripts by hand anymore. We live in a world where whether it's tools like Puppet or scripts that you've written in-house or tools from other vendors, or if you're using the cloud, you can bring machines up from nothing to fully ready to run your service in minutes, thousands of servers in minutes. That's something that you just couldn't do years ago. And we know that the expectations have changed, like I've talked about, but also that the workload has changed as well. If you're running a consumer service, it could blow up overnight and you need to respond to that scale. If you're running a business service, it could turn out that your business has shifted and the needs change. Those things happen. So we're also witnessing a number of movements that are kind of changing the way we work. You hear a lot about DevOps. That's something that we talk about a lot at Puppet Labs. And that, again, a movement of it. So these movements, whether it's DevOps, whether it's moving off to the cloud to move more quickly, it all boils back to that core point that people expect more of us. They expect us to do it faster. They expect us to do it more reliably. And they cannot afford to spend a whole lot more on people, on servers, on whatever the cost point is. Just, it's all ubiquity now. The internet is no longer a fad. It's something that everybody expects day to day. So it's not that there's no future, but there's no future in which we can do less. We're not going to have less physical servers. We're not going to have less services to run. And they're not going to be less critical. It's just moving forward. But that's not to say that we're going to have the standard services we have today. So I'll give you a flip-flop example from Penn State and Puppet Labs. At Penn State, we had this mentality that every core service that we need to do our business function is run in-house. So even if it was for the administrative services of the group we were working for or the student population, we ran their file services, we ran their email services, we ran their documents and print storage. All of those core services were run by us, in addition to the things that actually made our business tick, which were administration software for entering grades. It was software for doing tests. It was software for scheduling classes. All those kind of things that were core to our business, of course we ran, but all those other things we ran as well. And software as a service is kind of that movement towards what's your core business, focus on that, and use someone else who's focusing on that thing to do the rest. Dropbox is an example of that. File storage and sharing is their thing. They specialize in that. And if you want to use them, you don't have to do that anymore. That's not your specialty. So at Puppet Labs, we kind of take that. We run a lot of servers, but none of them are for internal file sharing or email or things of that nature. It's for our core business, which is software. We run a lot of servers to test software. We don't have any servers for file storage or email. So software as a service kind of pushes things towards specialization. It can free you up from managing those things that are mostly distractions from your core business. And enterprise pays the bills. So we hear a dime a dozen that consumer projects move forward, that people use those, but still we answer to the needs of our business. Whether your business is academia like mine was, those are what's paying the bills, those are what's driving IT forward, and those are what driving the tools that we use and the services we consume. So we're here to talk about Puppet Labs today and Puppet, and really what we're trying to do, regardless of the tool, regardless of where you come from, we're trying to drive down the cost of making these changes. The change that's expected of us, the rate of change that we're expected to do it in. We're trying to drive that cost down so that we can do it reliably, do it quickly, and do it in a cost-effective way. So Luke Knies, our CEO, started this company 8.5 years ago. He was a sysadmin himself, and he was using the tools of the day to try to make his work faster and more effective, to do more with less. But the tools were lacking, in his opinion, and so he started 8.5 years ago to write a tool that was easier to use, that was more flexible, and that he could use to do his work a lot faster. And then he sort of spurred a company from that. And we specialize in data center and cloud automation. So Puppet is primarily for servers. You can start seeing it manage things that are right on the side of that, whether it's the storage that facilitates those compute instances, or whether it's the networking aside from that. Regardless of whether it's physical infrastructure or using a cloud provider, we specialize in managing those things. We have customers that use Puppet for desktop management. You may yourself. Does anybody here use Puppet for desktop management? I'm always curious about that. I had a half hand up, couple hands. So that's something you can do as well. And that works just fine. But we primarily focus on servers and networks. And Puppet's base language is this. And one of its core strengths is that we're declaring how a server should look. Not what actions we want to take on it, not the various things we want to poke at, but at the end of the day, how should this server look in order to build the service I want? And so we'll have things like, this is what it takes to build SSH. I need a package on the system, I need a service running, and I need a file that looks a particular way. That's a very common pattern. And there's a few advantages of this. One is, look at the sysadmin down the hall and say, hey, we're building out this new service. This is what it looks like. You can read it. You can discuss it. You can use Git to kind of diff it. You can use code review tools on it. You can check it into version control. You can share it with your auditors. These kind of things are useful. Now, I did try, on that auditor's point, I did try at Penn State to share the Puppet code with our auditors, and they sort of got it. It takes a little bit of prodding because, A, you have to kind of wrap them around this shift. They're used to coming in to say, I know what to poke at on this system, I might understand the scripts to a degree, but in this case, you're saying, this is the documentation of how this machine is. I can show you the Puppet runs and the Puppet reports that say it's in the state it's supposed to be in. This is the description of that state. And they get it. And so that's becoming more useful all the time. Do any of you have to have annual reports with auditors? A couple of you? I had to do that a lot at Penn State. And it was, Puppet was, I think if I would have stayed at Penn State a little longer, Puppet would have been successful in that, but I think I left a little early. We'd only gone through 2 runs with them with Puppet. So once you declare how a system should look, and you could take SSH and then add on other things, and you can just have these building blocks that compose themselves together, that's all in this defined state. You define, my infrastructure looks like this. Puppet knows how to get it done. It knows what steps to take. It knows what order to take them in. But Puppet's about defining how that system should look. And Puppet allows you to simulate what would happen if you need to enforce that state. One of the core benefits of Puppet is that it says, I know how to look at the system and say, if it's the SSH package, I know how to inspect the packages on the system, determine if SSH is present, what version it is, and then I can compare that to what you've told me is the defined state. Package SSH should be version 1.0 or whatever it is. And so given that it can do those kinds of introspection, it can simulate what would happen. You can tell it then to enforce that state, and it'll run and do whatever changes are necessary. It won't just overwrite the system. It'll actually update that package if it's not the right version. It'll install it if it's not present. It'll compare the file on disk and change it if necessary, and then it reports back on what it does. And that's really through this life cycle. You have the Puppet Master, which is that central point where your definitions are stored, where you have a view into the system, and you have the nodes that you're managing with Puppet. So first thing it does is send some information to the Puppet Master, each node. And those are called facts. And those facts are things like, this is my operating system, I'm a Red Hat machine, for instance, my IP address, other information that it has. You can get hardware data, CPU, memory. You can extend that and really inquire anything you want on the system and have the Puppet Master know that information before it builds instructions. That next step, which we call the catalog phase, is the Puppet Master taking the information it knows about the machine it's going to manage, plus what you've defined as how it should be managed, and it compiles a set of instructions that are specific to that node. And those instructions will be, you're going to install the SSH package, this is the version I want, this is the configuration file I want, this is the service I want, and it sends those instructions down to the node. The node then goes through that either simulation or enforcement phase that we just talked about, and it sends the results of those actions up to the Puppet Master. So the Puppet Master will get information on, hey, I inspected the SSH package, it was all good, nothing happened, and so on. That fourth stage, also reporting, is sort of a representation of the more that you can do with Puppet's reports. So you get back this raw information of what actions I took or what state I found when I actually tried to enforce my catalog. But I can send that information to the Puppet Master, and I can send it off to a whole bunch of things. Our operations team drops it into HipChat. There's report processors for really anything out there now, which is really handy. And so the full stack of Puppet Enterprise and Puppet Open Source looks a bit like this. So on the Puppet Master, you have a number of services. One is that reporting interface where you think of our enterprise console or the open source dashboard. That's where you're viewing what's going on. You have graphical workflows for interacting with your systems. You can do some management there. You have administration controls, whether that's on the file system or up in the console. And you have all the content. And that content is either things you bring down from the Puppet Forge or things you've written in-house to say, this is how I want my server managed, this is how you should do it, that's content. Then you have multiple Puppet agents, and those agents can be anything, anything you want, whatever it is your core service. If you're a web server, an app server, whatever. So let's talk a bit about Puppet Enterprise. It's the reason I'm here to talk to you today. It's the product that Puppet Labs sells and enables us to continue building great software to automate your infrastructure problems. So the first thing underpinning all of this is its solid platform. Puppet Enterprise is a collection of all of our open source projects and all of this glue and configuration that, all the things you would do out of the box with open source. We've done it for you. It's 45 packages that we test against various platforms. It's tuned to scale out of the box so that you can configure any number of agents against it. And it has all of the components we saw in that architecture slide, so the reporting components, the workflows, the management components. It takes all of our open source projects, which I'll talk about a little later, mCollective, Hyra, Factor, Puppet itself, of course, all rolled up, tested, and ready to go. So ecosystem support. So this means, A, we run on a number of platforms, really everything that you want to manage, whether it's Red Hat, Solaris, AIX, Windows, all of those various operating systems are tested, supportable, and I neglected to mention our installer, which will take, regardless of those operating systems, let you install against, whether it's Puppet Master, I want a Puppet node, you can just say, go ahead, install it. All those things are taken care of for you. They're all pushed off to the side so that, for instance, if you're a Ruby shop and you have a Ruby web application running on your node, Puppet's written in Ruby, but we won't conflict with the Ruby stack that you're running for your service. We vendor everything out in Puppet Enterprise. An ecosystem also means support from Puppet Labs. So we have a support staff at varying levels of support that are ready to answer your phone call or your emails, file tickets, whatever it is. We have a team ready to help you get started or succeed. And we're going to go through some additional features here on the reporting side, on management, that are above and beyond what the open source offerings give you. So one of those is sorry, I'm combining two different words there. Event Inspector is what we call that in Puppet Enterprise. And this is pretty cool for me. I didn't get to use this at Penn State, and it's pretty new, I think Puppet 3.1, Puppet Enterprise 3.1. But all those reports you get back from the Puppet notes, which contain, hey, this is the thing I tried to manage, this is the state I found, this is the state I had to change it to, and the results of that change in state. And the Event Inspector in Puppet Enterprise lets you view those kind of activities through 3 different kinds of lenses, depending on the context, depending on what you're after in that particular day. And so that's via the classes that you care about. So I've defined SSH, I've defined Apache, I've defined my app. Whatever that bucket of configuration is that you want to manage, you can view in, I want to look at SSH changes throughout my infrastructure. You can also, of course, view things through the nodes that you care about. So I care about a particular machine or a particular set of machines today. I want to look at how they're doing and what changes are occurring throughout the infrastructure for them. And on that bottom side, if you want to get really granular, saying, look, I just want to update my SSH packages for the security vulnerability. I want to see how that change is occurring throughout my infrastructure. And I can drill into just that package, just that file, just that service, whatever resource you're managing with Puppet. We also have a tool called Live Management in Puppet Enterprise, which is, on this screen, remote control of Puppet agents. So you can run Puppet, you can disable Puppet across certain hosts, re-enable it, of course, get the status of the last run. And the status would be, this is when I ran, this is how many things changed, kind of that early data about what's going on. And this is all driven by mCollective on the back side. So it's all aside from Puppet. So if you've got Puppet services down for whatever reason, you can use Live Management to bring them back up again. And of course, control Puppet, whether it's a simulation run against a particular Puppet tag, all those things from a central location. Live Management also lets you drill down to exactly what resources are on these systems. Where in Event Inspector, you were looking at the change that occurred for a particular resource. Live Management is about what's the resource state right now when I'm asking you. And so in this case, what are we looking at? Groups. So you can ask for all groups. You can ask for a specific group across multiple resource types and get back how many nodes are managing that particular resource, and are they varied amongst those nodes. So it can be easy or really handy for before you're managing something with Puppet to reach out and say, what's the status of this thing out in the wild? And you'll get that status and the difference across all your nodes, and you can begin managing it with Puppet and start bringing it into a consistent state. So we also have cloud provisioning in Puppet Enterprise. So you may have heard of Node AWS, Node GCE. Those are cloud provisioners for connecting to, whether it's Google Compute, AWS, other cloud providers, and say, this is the instance I want, this is how big it is, this is the image that it should be built against, and it'll build that instance in that cloud service, but then it'll install Puppet on there, and it'll connect it to your Puppet master and get everything configured. You could even go as far as to say, when you've connected to the Puppet master, I expect it to be a web server, or whatever your classification is. With Puppet Enterprise, we also give you VMware cloud provisioning as well. So if you're running VMware in your infrastructure, you can do the same kind of thing. Build my machine, it looks like this, connect to my Puppet master, and get it configured so that you don't have to do those steps yourself. So that's Puppet Enterprise, and I want to talk to you about the open source technologies that make it possible. And I just want to touch for a moment on sort of the difference here. I think a lot of you have been using Puppet for a while, it's been evident, but for anyone who's not, Puppet Enterprise and Puppet open source are not sort of it's not a freemium model, it's not an open core model. We don't limit the power of our open source technologies to benefit the Puppet Enterprise model. That's not what Luke was setting out for. In fact, quite the opposite. 8.5 years ago when he was writing software, one of the driving forces was because technologies he was using in the day were like that. Now, we do need to make money as a company in order to provide open source technologies that people can use. We need to get paid so that we can eat. I need to be able to come and visit and talk to you. And we need to be able to continue to innovate on the open source side. So that's why we have Puppet Enterprise. It's so that we can survive as a company and so that we can provide a much better, higher end service because we because of those benefits. So all the kind of graphical technologies we're building on top, the live management, Event Inspector, the packaging and testing against all these platforms that we do, it's only possible because of Puppet Enterprise, because we can pay those people to do that kind of rigorous development and testing. And we can also afford to pay people to continue making open source great. So I want to step back for a moment. How many of you are using Puppet Open Source 3.0 or higher? Okay, that's our latest release that Puppet Enterprise uses, and that's really kind of, to me, the moment where we started to really click on having this company that can invest in these developers to make open source great. And one of those things that we're trying to push the envelope on now is make open source a technical proving ground. For a while, they were kind of in lockstep. Puppet Enterprise was built on top, and what we'd really like to do is start pushing the boundary further on what Puppet can do and what the other open source projects can do. And an example of that is if you've heard of the future parser that's out in open source, it's an off by default kind of thing that you can turn on, and the Puppet language, that DSL that you describe your systems in, can be enhanced to do more things. The future parser does a number of things. One of those is iteration. If you want to take something and loop through it, if you want to take something and map it to an array, those are things that the future parser can do, but it may be buggy, it may be sort of not quite baked in yet, we may change the syntax. Those things are something that the open source software can push the boundary on, and later on we get it into the enterprise product. So another goal of the open source projects is to be this core that everything else can rest on and be highly flexible. So that's not just Puppet, mCollective, Hiera, Factor as being core components, but you're going to start to see things like Puppet become more modular as well. So the different things that Puppet does, the reporting engine, the catalog compilation process, those things starting to be split out so that you can swap in different ideas for those. An example that my counterpart, Eric Sorensen, the product manager for open source, talks about a lot is an engineer from Spotify had written a new transport for Puppet, so the serialization format that goes across the wire between your agent and your master. They had written one that for their needs was much faster and quicker to get across the network and really save them time when they were doing their Puppet runs. And that's something where you made it a patch into the open source software, and it's one of those things that's, because Puppet's modular and flexible, you can just swap that in, and for his usage, that works great. And now that's available for other people to opt in on and try it out. And it may turn out that that's the default someday. But that's something that's only possible because we have open source software that's flexible and moving ahead of everything else. So the actual projects, of course, there's Puppet. And so that's the core technology that makes everything else possible. That has the language that you interact with to say, this is how my machine should be configured. Sorry, somebody put a ton of notes there and really threw me off. So Puppet is about a declarative state. You want Puppet to say, this is how my machine should run. You don't want to say, this is how I do it. It's not a script. It's not procedural. It's not about, well, if I'm on Red Hat, I'm going to query this particular package management system, and on apt, I'm going to do this other thing. Puppet abstracts all of that away for you so that you don't have to worry about it. Puppet worries about that. The people that contribute to open source worry about that. That's not your problem. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Puppet Forge later on. But one of the big benefits, at least for me when I was using Puppet, is the fact that you can express all of your systems in very modular configuration. You didn't have one big text file that had your entire infrastructure written down on it. You had a component of your infrastructure. SSH is the example we used earlier, your web server, your application server, your time service, your DNS. What are all the things that you need to make your service tick can be broken down into little components that can be shared across all your machines. Everybody who needs NTP gets NTP. Whenever you need to make a change to NTP, you make a change to the NTP module, and you can use that anywhere, and it's effective everywhere. And the Puppet Forge gives you tons of those components out of the box, ready to use. It's a community-contributed service, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So on the other side, we have mCollective, and again, that sort of complements Puppet. Puppet is that model-based infrastructure that says, this is how I want it to be, and I'm going to enforce that state. mCollective is about learning what's going on in your infrastructure and reporting in real time. So you can reach out and say, hey, all of my machines that are Red Hat that have this particular package, I want to know what your status is. You can do that via the command line. You can do that live management in Puppet Enterprise. And it does this all real time. All of the machines are listening on this message bus. If you've ever heard of ActiveMQ before or RabbitMQ, it's a message bus-based service that gives you real-time discovery of the machines that are listening, and it uses Factor to determine what they're doing, or sorry, who they are, and then you can determine what they're doing. PuppetDB is another example of an open source project that kind of got out there and breathed life into the open source space before we rolled it into Puppet Enterprise and Puppet Enterprise 3. And this is it is the database of all your Puppet-related things. So the reports that come back, the catalogs that compose the information every machine is to do, all of those things are stored in PuppetDB, which you can query through an API. And if anybody has used exported resources before, actually, I'm really curious about that. Anybody using exported resources? Nobody. Well, there's one over there. Great. So exported resources is sort of a technology that was a little bit difficult to use before PuppetDB because you had to do a lot of setup. It wasn't super fast. And really, PuppetDB was invented to solve that challenge and then ended up being a really great platform for storing and analyzing your configuration and your facts. So exported resources say, what's a good example? SSH keys. So every machine, if you're on a Unix-like system anyway, has an SSH key, and you may want to populate your known host file so that when you log into any known machine, you're not getting that message when you log in. You know that that key's been verified, et cetera. And exported resources allow you to say, for a given machine, I expect you to export your public key, and then I'm going to collect those on each machine and add them into known hosts. So it's kind of the same resource you declare in Puppet. There's a couple little things you add on to the front of it, and that just goes through PuppetDB. PuppetDB collects everything. It knows which machine it came from. It knows which machine should be getting that key, and then it injects that into the instructions for the next machine, which then puts it into its known host file. PuppetDB is really cool for that. If you're not using exported resources, at least go to docs.puppetlabs.com and read up about it. Factor, it's one of those critical components in the whole stack. This is how you know what your machines are. Whether it's just you're curious, what machines do I have running Red Hat version 6 versus version 5, or you want to make your configuration dependent on facts like that. That's what Factor enables you to do. So all these information, it's easily pluggable. You can write custom facts that says, I know how to run this system command to get this piece of data. You can just tell Factor about it, and Factor will start reporting that key value pair every time it runs. And you can use that information to change classification. So you might have something that says, I'm running in this particular data center or this particular rack, and when I do that, I need some particular networking configuration, or I need some particular information added to my MOTD, if it's something as simple as that. You put that into facts, and then when you're describing your infrastructure, you can use that fact to say, hey, if I'm this guy, I want you to do this. So Hiera is sort of, aside from that, it's taking the data about your infrastructure and separating it from the model of your infrastructure. So that DSL code I was showing you is really your model. And very quickly, once you get started with Puppet, and I'm guessing a lot of you learned this already, if you hard code all the things about your infrastructure in that, so SSH should be version X, this package name is Y, whatever those things are that could change, whether it's over time, I need to update my versions, or it's because my infrastructure is different. If I have a heterogeneous environment, things change based on the operating system I'm running. Hiera is a tool to help you keep those things separate so that your model is the same, and you can use that across your entire infrastructure, but then the things that are different, the package version, the package name, things of that nature, can be separated out into something a little more logical. And so Hiera is a tool for saying, if I get my facts back and I get an operating system Debian, I'm going to look in this file, I'm going to find the package name is going to be something different. It's kind of like that. So Razor is the open source platform for bare metal provisioning. This was a partnership with EMC about a year ago, I think. And it's something that we've taken in-house and we're building out and making it ready for Puppet Enterprise. And it's something you can use today to take hardware that you have, rack it, give it power, give it network, and connect it via DHCP and a Pixie boot network into Razor. And Razor, when it sees that new machine coming live, will put a little microkernel on it that's running mcollective and factor, and it learns, I have these many CPUs, this is the kind of disk I have, this is how much of it I have, all those things it learns about your system, and then runs it through rules that you've set up. And so imagine that one of your rules is, when I see a machine that's 64 gigabytes of RAM and a certain amount of disk, I'm going to make it a VMware hypervisor. And so that rule will then say, okay, well then it needs to get this ESXi hypervisor injected onto it, then I need to connect it into vSphere, I might have some Puppet configuration for that. Those are things that you can set up in Razor. And you can do that based on demands, so you could say, I want every machine coming in to run through these rules. You might say, I want to create a pool and then start adding machines from that pool into a various service. And it does make physical machines as easy to provision in a sense as VMs. So this isn't so much an open source project as it is a process on the open source side. And that's really core to open source at Puppet Labs. We want to make development on those projects in the open. We want your contributions, whether it's via a bug request or a bug report or a feature request, to be in the open as well. And sometimes it's not as simple as saying, hey, this Puppet has a bug here and I need you to fix it. Or, hey, I'd really like it if the reporting was, you could run reports to give some service reporting mechanism I have. It might be something that drifts into the internals of Puppet that will be a really dramatic change. We still want a method for you to have a conversation about that change and why it's important to you, what are you trying to accomplish. That's what Puppet Armatures is. It's a process for saying, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. It's kind of a deliberate process, and it's a way to get a conversation going with the development team and the product team at Puppet Labs on, what am I trying to do? Okay, we can do it. If you want to contribute code yourself, that's great. Otherwise, we now have all the information we need to get other open source contributors or the development team at Puppet Labs on board. So the Puppet Forge, that's my baby. I should contribute a prettier slide for it, but it is a module repository for everybody to contribute to. We have about 2,000 individual modules now, contributed by over 600 of you. Is anybody in the room a contributor to the Puppet Forge? Thank you, thank you, thank you, even though you work for us. So I started at the Puppet Labs in 2011. I took over the Forge in July of 2012. And when I did that, we didn't have a dedicated team to the Puppet Forge. It had been a project that the company had kind of gone on and done, but we didn't have sort of the staff that we have now to dedicate to it. And so I was sort of the start of that. We brought me in onto the Puppet Forge. We hired a UX designer. We had an engineer now dedicated to it, and we've been growing that team since. And I've just been thrilled by the interest our community's had. We've gone from, I think, 200 some individual contributors to 600, from about 300 pieces of content to nearly 2,000 in that time since I'd started. And we're trying to keep up with all the things that you want from the Forge and how to make it easier to find the modules that are relevant to you, that are good modules, and how to best contribute your own. And we'll talk about that a little more today. Puppet Labs itself. Again, the Forge didn't have a dedicated team. Now it does. That story is really echoes throughout all of Puppet Labs. We were about 60 people when I started, and now we're, I think, 240, 250. I can't keep track of the numbers. Every week, it's a big milestone. And so we're really trying to get to a point where we have lots of people really excited about all the open source projects, about Puppet Enterprise, about whatever it is we're doing as a company, and then, of course, whatever the next big thing is. And when I started I think it's worth noting that I started as professional services, and that was all about getting people excited about Puppet, how it can help you do your job better, and sort of how you can succeed with it without spending too much time. And that's something that I've been really interested in Puppet Labs for, is everybody shares that, whether they're in professional services, whether they're engineering, whether they're in finance, working on, getting everyone paid. Everybody's excited about what we're trying to do, and that sort of just bleeds into the work we do, and it's really exciting. And I think that's in no small part because our customers and our users, all of you, are all super excited about the software and what it does for you. And what really shocked me when I came in, I was sort of looking at Puppet through a very narrow lens, thinking it was all education, open source customer or open source users using Puppet. And I learned really quickly that it's quite the opposite. Whether it's open source usage or Puppet Enterprise customers, it's a very broad spectrum of usage. And that's shocking to me. Whether it's something as stringent as government, all the way to kind of leading edge internet companies. Everybody's got a use case for it. And everybody either needs to provision their web service really quickly, or they're trying to enforce some sort of standard on their desktop infrastructure, or it's really all over the map. Talk to us today about some of their stories. And of course, we're hiring. If you know someone who's interested in a job, or if you are yourself, all these different, really, it changes all the time. puppetlabs.com/jobs if you're interested in that. It's quite broad. So, what's next? You're here today. You're going to learn a lot about other people using Puppet, what they find successful, what they've learned. And if you leave today and you want to learn more, if you want to participate in the community, there's a number of ways you can do that. You can sort of join the various mediums for interacting with the community. And so that's anything from the mailing list, from IRC. There's a Stack Overflow style site, ask.puppetlabs.com, which we launched last year, that has been pretty interesting. And that's sort of a complement to the mailing list. We have a Google group, Puppet Users, which is fairly prolific. Lots of people there ready to help. Same with the RC channel. We're one of the biggest channels on Freenode. Just jump in anytime. You can ask a quick question, usually get a quick response, quick and helpful response. And ask is sort of a more of a long form thing. You drop an answer on, maybe somebody's already answered it, and you can just search for it, and that's an option for you as well. And that's sort of, I want to get help, or I want to help others, those mechanisms. But if you want to get more in depth, and maybe you're using Puppet and you ran into something that you feel is a bug, and you want to contribute that bug, we have triage-a-thons that you'll see. I think they're communicated on both the mailing list and IRC pretty regularly. In fact, there's a mailing list that's just announcements. If you don't want to get all the interactions back and forth with the community, but when you want to learn about community events, Puppet Announce is that mailing list. And so we have bug triage-a-thons where you can come in and help verify that bugs are legit, that they have all the information we need to help solve them. You can kind of work with engineers on your bug if they're available. And if you're willing, you can contribute code. And the triage-a-thon, it might be a good time to learn, how do I contribute to Puppet Core? What are the kind of the rules associated with it? How can I be successful doing that? And then, of course, I would recommend you contribute your modules to the Forge. And that's truly, I'll get a little, how much time do I have? Well, I have time to talk to you about Forge. So what was exciting sorry, Brianna? Okay, all right, I won't talk too much about Forge. I do have some time later, but I get really excited about Forge because it's, well, I'll tell you my story at Penn State. I told you I left Penn State, and I left with code that I had written entirely in-house. I didn't know about the Forge at the time, and so I didn't use any modules from the Forge, naturally. And so I left with one other sysadmin, one other Red Hat sysadmin, who knew how to run Puppet, knew kind of where the configurations were, and if he brought a new machine online, he knew how to go in and manage the site definition and get that machine doing what it was supposed to do. But he didn't really understand the DSL. I mean, he could read it well enough, but he didn't know how to write it from scratch. He didn't know how to manage the modules, what did what where. And of course, I learned a lot about how, once I left Penn State, on how to write better modules, and I'll share some of those lessons today. But to me, the Forge represents a way to solve a problem where I left. I had written all the code in-house. They were struggling just to keep up on the Red Hat side of the house. The other sysadmin was working on our GPFS file system and getting all the core services ready to go, where I was kind of on the other side of the spectrum, getting the higher end services going. And they hired a CF Engine guy to replace me. And so they were faced with the decision of, do I teach this guy how to use Puppet and teach the other guy how to use Puppet and maintain the infrastructure we have, or do we rewrite everything we need in CF Engine? And that's a decision that they should have had to face. Regardless of the philosophical differences between the software, you shouldn't be left in that place where the entire spectrum of what you do is left in that person, that champion that kind of brought Puppet in and got it going. And hopefully that's not the case in your environment. But to me, the Forge represents a way to limit that risk. So a lot of people who've written modules that do a thing from core level services all the way up to kind of middleware stacks, it's really broad at this point, and they're contributing software that does a job for them and hopefully does a job for you, and then for attracting other people who are contributing that. Maybe they're adding a new platform. Maybe they're fixing a bug that they found because their use case is different. That's what the Forge enables. And whether it's a module you get from Puppet Labs or a module you get from a guy down the street, it's code that's there that you can take a look at and use in your infrastructure and get maintained by the community and not leave you in a position where everything was written in-house. Contribute your modules to the Forge. Help make that a reality. So you can also go to one of our trainings. When I was in professional services, I was delivering these courses. You'll get hands-on attention from somebody who's been using Puppet in the field forever, has learned all the lessons, can talk to you about it ad nauseum. And we have a number of different courses for that. Puppet Fundamentals is where you would get started with how do I kind of get my module going, how do I learn how the system interacts with itself, all of these things. You can go to the advanced course where you want to start doing more things with Puppet and kind of exercise the tools in a way you hadn't thought of doing before. If you're interested in extending what Puppet can do out of the box, the Extending Puppet course is for you. The extensions to Puppet are written in Ruby. In the case of custom facts, it's really kind of, you need to know enough Ruby to build the boilerplate where you insert your system command and whatever you're doing to parse the results. But then on up to types and providers, there's a little more Ruby on how do I interact with the system to say, Java key stores is the one that came to mind there. And then the bottom tier there is certification. So once you've kind of learned what you're doing with Puppet, if you want to be certified, if you want a credential to take to a client you have or to a new job or whatever it is that says I've certified myself at a certain level of Puppet knowledge, we have that for you as well. And on fundamentals, I saw it sliding through on the rotating slides, I think February 20th or something like that. There's a fundamentals training here in Silicon Valley. So check that out. Take a look at the rotating slides between the presentations. And there's a discount on the slide? Great. So if you're interested in attending that Puppet Fundamentals, thank you, Scott. There's a discount for being here today. Take a look at that or find one of us, and one of us with the Puppet shirts, and we'll help you out. And people love the training. I don't know if I was the reason that we have that red dot there, but I went to Bangalore, India, to talk to people about using Puppet there. And so whether it's here or on the other side of the planet, literally, people love these courses. They love learning about Puppet. And it's really exciting to do these trainings and to hear what you're doing with Puppet. If you can't make it halfway across the world to learn Puppet hands-on, we do have online trainings that are more digestible, smaller form things. Like I just want to learn about Hire today. I can just take a couple 5-minute courses or 15 minutes or whatever the course is. It's video-based. There's little exercises and quizzes so that you can test whether or not you've learned what you thought you learned. And those are all free. So that's puppetlabs.com/learn. Take a look at that. So also, if you're more interested in what features we're building, whether it's on the open source side, enterprise side, on the Forge, whatever it is, we have this program called Puppet Test Pilots. And internally, as a product owner, I get to a point where I've been speaking with all of you, I've been watching the mailing list, all these different inputs, and I think I know how to solve your problem, and we want to validate that. And so I'll reach out to a group that runs the test pilots, and they'll email out to you and say, hey, if you're interested in the Puppet Forge, we're talking about search filtering today, and we'd like to learn whether it's going to be useful to you. And so we'll sit you down with a prototype, we'll ask you questions, we'll observe how you use our products. It's typically 1 hour over a remote screen share. You don't have to come to Portland for it. And usually we'll offer you some compensation for your time. And we're just truly interested in your feedback on how we can make the products better. So puppetlabs.com/PTP. Sign up for that. It's all opt-in. It's not a spam base. We're just going to send you information on what products we're developing and how you can help. And if you're interested, you could jump in. I can't stress this enough. If you're here, especially in San Francisco in September, come to PuppetConf. Consider coming. There's really, I've just been blown away every year by the breadth and amount of content from sysadmins, from developers, people that are using Puppet, people that are not using Puppet yet, all these kind of people that are doing interesting things in our space. Come to PuppetConf, they talk about it, they share their experiences. There's tons of people to interact with from any community you can imagine. last year at the Fairmont was amazing. I don't know how we're going to do better, but I'm sure we will. Yeah, so I think I left hopefully enough time. Sorry, Brianna. I had to get my Forge rant out. What can I tell you about Puppet Labs, about our software, about Bangalore? Yes?
You mentioned Puppet DB. Is that open source based? And if it isn't, why not?
The question was if Puppet DB was open source based, and it is. It's open source software, and in Puppet Enterprise, it's the same kind of story where we do extra validation and make sure it works against the full stack and against all the platforms we support for Puppet Masters, and so that's where the enterprise tie-in comes in. But Puppet DB is open source.
I meant more in terms of whether you created it or whether you're using existing open source.
Oh, I'm sorry. For everyone else, the clarification was on whether it's based on open source software. And so Puppet DB is a little bit this core software that understands what a catalog is, what the facts are, what the reports are, the API that you use to introspect that. That's all written in-house by us. What we do use a open source database on the back end. That's Postgres by default. I think you can plug in a couple others. But that's, yes, we're using existing database software for that. Anyone else? Okay, well, if you don't have questions now, we're going to have questions at the expert panel later. Did you have a follow-up?
It wasn't clear to me whether all of Factor, Hyra, and Razor, if all three of those are available only in enterprise version or if they're also available.
All of those projects I mentioned, Hyra, mCollective, Factor, PuppetDB, Razor, are all open source projects. Puppet Enterprise is a collection of all those things, no features restricted. And so Puppet Enterprise, again, just to recap, it's a validation of all of those things. So we do extra rigorous testing that all of them work within their specific components together. We test that against every operating system that we support. And then on top of that, we have the Enterprise Console, which gives you a central control point for reporting, for reaching out over mCollective to machines, for kind of taking a look at what PuppetDB is telling you. All of those things are built on top of those open source projects. Yes, sir? Puppet Enterprise licensing is the question, and that's based on per node. And we do have Kyle in the back. He's raising his hand. He's our sales guy in town today. If you want to go into details, feel free to talk to him. But it is per node based, and it's just based on the volume of nodes you want to manage. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking to manage, whether it's Puppet Masters or nodes, it's all accounted for the same. Yes, sir?
And a node is physical or virtual or either?
Sorry, that was the clarification I was trying to make and didn't. The difference between the nodes for anyone else is whether it's virtual, physical, whatever it is, it's the same price. Whether you're provisioning with Razor or our cloud provisioning software. And the first 10 are free. You can download Puppet Enterprise and use it for 10 nodes anytime you want. And I highly encourage you guys to do that. Even if you're intending on using the open source projects, the 10 nodes of Puppet Enterprise, you install it. The installer is really simple. All the projects are there. All the components are there for you to get started with. You can really get used to Puppet and what it can do for you. And if you're not ready to go with Puppet Enterprise yet, you at least have everything going. You didn't have to learn how to set up those components and get them going. I highly recommend starting that way. Yes, sir.
Can you explain the function of Razor a little bit more?
Okay.
Is it like, you said that bare metal provisioning on VMware, right? So it is going to spin up new instances and then configure it? What exactly is it?
Okay, he was looking for some more clarification on Razor. The example I gave was that Razor would take some bare metal and provision a VMware cluster from it. And that's just one use case. Razor is truly meant for bare metal provisioning. So we have our cloud provisioners, which say, I'll work out to one of these cloud services and get myself an instance and then configure it. Razor, I'm going to stand back into the light here. The Razor allows you to do the same thing for bare metal, regardless of what the destination is for that bare metal. So that one use case that I'm familiar with was just provisioning a VMware cluster from I racked it, I gave it power and network. But if you are using physical database services and you just want a machine that's running, a Red Hat flavor or Windows or whatever it is you want to provision, it'll provision that OS for you. and then it'll connect it to your Puppet Master, just like the cloud provisioner does, and then you could tell it this is what it's to do, get it configured. In essence, you plug it in, you give it power, you give it network, and then based on the rules you've defined, it'll take information from that node. I have this many CPUs, I have this kind of hardware based on it, and then I'm going to provision that, whatever operating system I want, whatever configuration I want on top. That's what it's intended to help you do.
Is this SSH call or the API call to the SSH?
For Razor?
Can you repeat the question?
What was your question about the transport for ESXi?
Yeah, when you try to manage SSI, right? So is it making the SSH call or just API?
Okay. And so I guess let me back up. So when you have Razor, and when Razor initiates with a machine, it puts on its own microkernel. So it's just a small Linux operating system with mcollective and factor on it and Puppet and so forth. And so it'll then get that machine to a point where you can understand what it has on it and how it fits into the rules you defined. And that's all over HTTPS. And so once you've taken the point where it's going to go and provision that machine, it's going to be based on whatever you're provisioning. So if you're...
But like right after you provision, let's say once the ESXi got installed, and to manage the ESXi through the cluster, how you connect it to it?
Yeah, for ESXi specifically, I believe it is their SOAP API. It is the vendor's API. I just don't remember the specifics. I think it's SOAP. If you go to the Forge and search for VMware, VMware's contributed modules for configuring both vCenter, which they have in our namespace, and then for the sort of consoles that sit on top as well, and they're using their APIs to contact that. You're welcome. Anyone else? We got a couple minutes left. Yes, sir.
Do you get the question much that if you get into Puppet, you could do something bad to all your systems? Somebody could do that. So, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, the comment here is that, have I heard with Puppet that you can get yourself into a position where all your machines break equally as fast,
Or
right?
they could all be hacked to do something. You put something in.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll talk about, there's a couple of aspects of that, and let me know if I'm not answering it. But first of all, yes, Puppet A, you're declaring how a machine should be configured, and then you're using that configuration across a number of hosts. And so you could get yourself into a situation where you mistype your package name or put the wrong version in there or whatever you want to do that kind of gets it into a state that everything blows up. And there's a couple of ways you can avoid that. And Puppet makes it easy to kind of take that configuration, which is just on disk, and separate it out by what we call environments. And so with both our provisioning technologies and just the DSL being on files, you can easily say, I want 10 machines that represent production that use the same configuration plus this change I wish to make. And you can run Puppet on all those nodes and kind of see how it goes, and to use that as sort of canary testing. Later on today, I'll talk about how you can test your modules individually so that you're knowing every change I make to this module is not going to break Puppet itself or is going to test the actual results of running Puppet against what I expect. So you can do those kind of things to protect against it. On that second thread that you mentioned about someone hacking into your system, I want to mention a couple of things. A, if someone hacks into an individual node that you're managing, the only information they get and can get access to is the information that they already have by being on that node. When that node connects into the Puppet Master and gets instructions, it gets instructions specifically for it and only for it. It has no information about anyone else on the network and what their configuration is. And they can't inject anything from the client side. They can't say, hey, I wish to be an app server now, even though I'm supposed to be a database server. That's all controlled on the Puppet Master. If you know a machine is invalid, you can revoke its certificate so it can't even make requests anymore to retrieve information about its current state. On the Puppet Master side, of course, just like every other machine that is, whether it's your central SSH server or whatever central command and control systems you have now, the Puppet Master should be treated with care. It is a server that does control the configuration of all your machines, treat it with care. Our services communicate over HTTPS. We do bidirectional verification of certificates that were signed at provisioning time. So we do take every step to make sure nobody can inject things into the traffic between the two machines. You can't fake that one machine's the master when it's really not. But if someone does violate your Puppet Master, you're in trouble. And one of the benefits there is that you can quickly rebuild that Puppet master, regenerate your certificates, your configuration is still valid, and if you're using it, storing it in version control, you can quickly detect whether someone's tampered with it. Is that okay? All right, and we have an expert panel later on where if you didn't get your question answered, come chat with us then, and I think back up for our next talk. Thank you for your time this morning.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan.